In today's podcast, we are going to talk about parenting styles. In subtle and maybe not so subtle ways, we are influenced by our early life experiences as far as what kind of parent we become. Have you ever had a parent moment when you said to yourself, and this might have been before you were even a parent, I will never do that. I will never be like that parent. And then you were. It may have been your own parents. It may have been something that you witnessed from a friend's family or something that you witnessed as an adult. I remember before I became a parent, I was in a department store and I was looking at clothing. I'm not a big shopper, and so I tend to go along with my partner and just kind of occupy my time. And I was standing in a clothes section, and this little boy comes racing down the aisle, and he dives into this circular kiosk of clothing, and he disappears in the middle of it. And about a minute later, this mom comes barreling down the pathway of this department store saying, Bobby, where are you? When I find you, you're really going to get it. And I thought to myself, I am never going to be like that. I am never going to be that parent. And for all we know, Bobby's still there, buried in that circle of clothing, hiding. But I discovered years later, when I became a parent, I was really able to appreciate the level of frustration that that parent was really experiencing with that child who was misbehaving in that moment. And I think that all of us have probably had moments like that where we were perhaps judgy or thought another parent wasn't doing as good of a job as we could. And then when we had our own experiences as parents, we thought, oh my, this is not Kansas anymore. We're in a different place. And I think that that's really important for us to think about. So where do we learn about becoming a parent? Well, from our early life experiences watching adults in our lives, certainly from our moms and dads, our relatives, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles. And we might pick up a range of how to do things. And some of us may have a long list of things we want to do that are just like the way our parents parented. Or we might have a list of things we don't want to do. We would not want to do those things, repeat those discipline approaches, or repeat those techniques that our parents did to us. Or maybe we come up with a combination. Some things we want to keep, some things we want to leave behind. And I think that that's pretty normal. There's a range. As adults, we learn from watching others. We might ask others who have experienced parenting. We might learn from watching shows and movies about families. We might learn from social media. We might go to websites or discussion sites where we have conversations or ask questions. And sometimes we get good information, and just as often we get information that's perhaps not as reliable. We might go to internet sources. We might do podcasts or YouTube, books and magazine articles, or from parenting programs. So there's a lot of sources that we can get information from as parents. And yet we still have to ask ourselves, what kind of parent are we? What kind of parent are you? And I want to talk about parenting styles, because I think this is an important way to start looking at your current place as a parent and decide if this is where you want to stay. It could be good, or if it's something that you can maybe do some work on changing. Parenting styles play a huge role in shaping a child's life experience. Parenting styles alone, they're not the only factor that determines outcome. We can't account for children's temperament. Children are born with a certain temperament. We can't always account for social and environmental factors. We don't control all of those things. They also play key roles. As parents, we can't control what kind of temperament. I screwed that up. I went into too much detail there, and I didn't need to. So I'll pause. But we can be aware of the kind of parent we are and the kind of parent we want to be. So what parenting style do you have? Psychologist Diana Baumrind in the 1960s identified three main parenting styles. The fourth style was later added in the 1980s by Stanford researchers Eleanor McCoby and John Martin. These styles are, and I'll just list them now and then we'll take a deeper dive into each of them: authoritarian, authoritative, permissive, and neglectful. And think about parenting styles on a continuum, maybe two different continuums, two different dimensions. And if you could visualize or imagine, or if you were sitting down and had a blank sheet of paper, just drawing the paper into 4 sections, putting a cross in the middle of it. So you've got 4 quadrants. So there's 2 dimensions. On the horizontal dimension, we would call that the responsiveness dimension. And that really helps us to understand how nurturing the parent is. And on the vertical axis, or line, we would call that the demandingness dimension. And that really references the level of discipline or expectation, structure, routine that we have or expect for our children. The reason we talk about these 2 dimensions is that these are the dimensions that typically are covered or discussed, or are the pillars of most evidence-based parenting programs. And so they're really important elements to the parenting experience. Demandingness refers to how parents control their children's behavior or demand maturity. That's the vertical line. And then responsiveness refers to how much parents are accepting and sensitive to their children's emotional and developmental needs. Let's start with the one that I think most people would agree is the preferred approach, authoritative. I know it sounds a lot like authoritarian, but I want to make sure that we distinguish between them. Authoritative, if we look at those 2 dimensions, parents that are authoritative have pretty high expectations. They are fairly high in demandingness, but they are also high in responsiveness. So authoritative parenting involves high expectations for achievement, for kids to do well, and also it involves parents who are warm and responsive to children in supporting them and when they struggle. These are the kinds of parents who set rules and enforce boundaries. They pay attention, they monitor, they have conversations with their children, they provide guidance, they let them fail and make mistakes, and they also help them and encourage them to pick up and keep working. And they use appropriate discipline. The consequence typically is brief, and it fits the behavior. It's not something that is forever or is really, really punitive. They provide reasoning and explanations for their actions to the age of the child. It's appropriate to the age the child is at. And the explanations give that child a sense of understanding, and it's really intended to teach them. Sometimes parents can over-talk or can over-explain things to young children, and that can become a problem we'll cover in a different episode. But they tend to lean toward giving an explanation rather than because I said so. And explanations give the child a sense of awareness, teaches them about values and morals. It helps them connect the dots between their behavior and how their behavior affects others. Now, that's a description of the parents, but they've been studying this since the 1960s, and so we know what the outcomes are for children when they are raised in homes where parents are more authoritative. They appear happy and content as a group. They appear to have more independence. They tend to be more active. They tend to have higher academic performance. They tend to feel better about themselves. They like themselves. They have a better set of social skills with other kids and other adults. They generally have better mental health, less episodes of depression, anxiety, suicide attempts, delinquency, or substance use. They tend to be less aggressive or violent. They have what we call a secure attachment, and they have good relationships with their parents. We regard this as the best parenting style among the 4 types of parenting because of the outcome. When parents parent this way, kids tend to do better, which is what our goal is for all of our children. The next style is called the authoritarian style. And it's represented, if you think back to that graph that we just talked about, where you've got the 4 quadrants, it's the one that has high demandingness, high expectations, but not a lot of warmth, not a lot of responsiveness. So while both styles we've just talked about, the one we did and one we're now talking about, involve high standards, the authoritarian style tends to be more directive, more obedience or status-driven. It's like when I say jump, you say how high. Parents can be very strict. They demand what's called blind obedience to their child. They don't like giving explanations. And because I said so is really a common retort that frankly doesn't work so well with young children, and it really doesn't work at all with teenagers. The authoritarian parenting style is known as a disciplinarian parenting style. And from my experience, sometimes it is a style that falls to the father or falls to the step-parent, which is a pretty easy way to make that relationship really stressful. Authoritarians parents view themselves as authority figures. They use stern discipline or harsh punishment, sometimes even corporal punishment, in order to obtain control of their child, to get their behaviors better, to get their attitude better. Their disciplinary strategies are pretty dictatorial. I'm telling you because I'm in charge. They're domineering. And when it comes to communication, they tend to experience one-way communication. I talk, you listen. Little children are to be seen and not heard. Any attempt to reason with them is kind of seen as talking back. They tend to be unresponsive to their children's needs, not generally nurturing, and they believe their harsh discipline is justified because it'll help prepare their children for the real world. It'll toughen them up and make them more resilient. And I get why parents might believe that, but the research would suggest that that is not the outcome that children experience. Again, we've been studying this for 50 years, and we know outcomes by looking at family systems where children grew up with more authoritarian styles. They tend to have a more unhappy disposition. They tend to be more dour or more negative. They tend to be less independent. They don't want to make decisions because they don't want to make mistakes. They tend to be insecure about those decision-making things because they're not sure if they're going to get in trouble. They struggle with self-esteem because they haven't had a lot of affirmations. They sometimes engage in more rebellious behavior, or they have more behavioral issues. They have less skill at regulating their emotions. They tend to have more temper tantrums. They usually don't do as well in school academically. They struggle with peer relationships. They struggle with substance use issues. They have fewer coping skills, and they're more prone to experience depression later in life. The third group I want to talk about is the permissive parent, sometimes referred to as the indulgent parent. And if you think back to that graph we've talked about, they tend to have low demandingness, not a lot of expectations, not a lot of structure or routine, and high responsiveness, a lot of nurturing. That's the good part. Permissive parents set very few parental rules and boundaries. And I think part of it's because they don't want their children to be mad at them. They don't want their children to argue with them. They don't want to feel bad. And so they want their children to like them. And one way to do that is to not say no. And part of parenting is learning how to say no and understanding that children aren't always going to like hearing that. And so if there are rules, passive parents tend to be reluctant to enforce them, and they hope that kids just make the right decision. Sometimes they do, but not all the time. Indulgent parents are warm, which is good, but they don't like to disappoint their children. And lenient parents are generally carefree, but they're less likely to foster the growth of their children's emotional regulation skills because they don't have a lot of high expectations. And they might say things like, oh, kids will be kids, or that's normal. And it is true, kids will be kids, and some things are normal. But when it becomes a problem, it's something that needs to be addressed. The outcomes, based on research for the past 50 years, is that children who grow up in homes where there is more permissiveness don't really follow clear rules. They don't know how to do that because they've never had to. They have poorer skills at regulating their emotions. They lack self-control. They may have problems with aggression. They tend to have lower self-confidence. They tend to be pretty self-centered or self-absorbed. And they might encounter more problems with relationships and social interactions in the future because many other people have more rule-based behaviors, and they tend to follow rules instead of not following them. The last group is called the neglectful parent, or the uninvolved or disengaged parent. And I think people would say this is a group that everybody likes to dislike, and I want to be cautious about that because people aren't neglectful on purpose, at least many times from my experience. They're characterized by having low demandingness and low responsiveness, so not a lot of expectations, not a lot of warmth. Neglectful parents don't set firm boundaries or high standards. Sometimes they're not even in their children's lives. They may not be able to be in their children's lives. They may be struggling with severe depression or anxiety or addiction or something that takes them away. They may also be in a job, like a military position, where they're just not available, where they're called to serve, where they can't be there for their child. And while on the one hand we may see that as a bad thing for the family, they may be doing something good for others. So I want to be really cautious about judging this particular group. The uninvolved parent may have unresolved issues themselves, like addiction, trauma, abuse, depression. And very often it's because, if you go back to our conversation earlier about our social inheritance, perhaps that was what they experienced growing up. And so they don't have good models themselves. When we look at the data, the outcomes from children who grew up in neglectful homes, they typically struggle with school. They have lower performance there. They may be more impulsive. They struggle again with self-regulation. And they may encounter more delinquent or addiction problems. They are also more likely to have mental health issues, especially in adolescence. And they're more prone to substance use disorders as they get older. So I've just laid out 4 different parenting styles. I pointed out the first, authoritative, the one that I think most parents want to be like. But I also want to maybe sort through this a little bit better, because we tend to think in boxes, and people aren't in boxes. There can be more than one parenting style that you experienced as a child. When you think about it, if you had more than one parent might have been really nurturing and responsive and also firm, and the other parent might have been really strict. One parent might have been uninvolved, and the other parent might have been permissive. Or you might have had sets of parents. One household, maybe it was really strict. The other household, maybe it was really permissive. And so on the one hand, you may have more choices for what kind of parenting style you want to adopt. On the other hand, you might be confused because they're not all bad. They have some qualities that are good, at least the first 3 that we discussed. And so there can be more than one parenting style you experienced. There can also be more than one parenting style that you have expressed. Anyone who's listening to this podcast can appreciate that you've had on days and off days, or periods of your life as a parent that maybe you were preoccupied with something else, a job loss, a sick parent where you just weren't as available to your own children, or maybe you were going through a rough time, and so your parenting approach is a little more permissive or a little bit more strict than you would have wanted it to be looking back. And I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of grace here, because there are no perfect parents. And when you know better, you do better. So think about what kind of parenting style you are and what kind of parenting style you want to be. Can we change our parenting styles? Absolutely, yes. One of the highlights of my day is when a parent says they want to change their approach because what they're doing isn't working anymore. So how do we do it? Well, we do it by learning new tools, which is what you're listening to. You're learning new strategies. And we practice. These things aren't like flipping a switch. It takes practice every day. Take time to invest in your relationship with your child. Even 5 to 15 minutes each day can make a difference for you in your relationship with your child. And some more food for thought. Which parenting styles did you see growing up? Remember, you had no say in how your parents decided to parent you. Also consider, your parents had no say in how their grandparents parented them. And your grandparents had no say in how they were parented by their parents. I think you can see the problem. None of us have ever had much say in how we were parented as children. And we've tended to carry over things we learned from previous generations. Another approach is to go back to our original goals. How do you want to be remembered by your children? What kind of parent do you want to be? Take a few minutes and think about that guiding question. How do you want to be remembered by your children when your grandchildren ask what it was like growing up with you? Look at the different parenting styles. Where do you see yourself most of the time? Are you okay with the space you occupy there? Do you want to move toward becoming more authoritative? The parenting style that has the best outcomes for children? What changes would you need to make on that dimension of demandingness, structure, routine, consistency? What changes would you need to make on that dimension of responsiveness, nurturing, caring, showing affection, each day, each week, in order to move in that direction? Where do you want to be as a parent? Thank you for tuning in and listening to this parenting topic. I hope that this information added to your growing toolbox for parenting your child or children. Please consider exploring other topics in this series. Remember, no one parenting tool can do everything. We need many tools to become the best parent for our children. Your children's future depends on you and the time and effort you invest in them today.